I never intended to step foot inside his house. And yet that day changed everything. It began with the simplest of actions. A gesture born out of concern. My husband was away on a business trip, leaving me to spend another quiet, lonely day at home. That morning, I busied myself with cleaning and aimlessly scrolling through social media, trying to push away the growing sense of monotony in my life. Around noon, I heard it, a strange noise coming from Arthur's house.
At first, I brushed it off as a distant sound. Maybe the old plumbing acting up. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, becoming a steady rush of water. My stomach knotted with worry. Arthur, my neighbor, was a kind man. A figure of quiet dignity who had lived alone since his wife's passing. Though we weren't particularly close, I'd always admired his calm demeanor and the way he carried himself. Even after such a profound loss, he seemed strong and resilient. Yet, the thought of him alone in that house made me uneasy. What if he'd fallen? What if he needed help? As I glanced out the window, I noticed something that only heightened my concern. His front door was slightly ajar. My heart raced. That wasn't like Arthur. Arthur was meticulous. The kind of person who always double-checked everything. Something had to be wrong.
I hurried over, standing at his doorstep, my nerves prickling with hesitation. Arthur? Are you all right? My voice carried into the quiet of his home. But no response came. The sound of rushing water inside only grew louder, fueling my anxiety. I paused, torn between respecting his privacy and the nagging fear that he might be in trouble. What if he had collapsed and couldn't call for help? My imagination painted the worst-case scenarios. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open a little wider and stepped inside. The living room was spotless, just as I'd expected. Everything was in its place. And the faint, familiar scent of aftershave hung in the air. But the sound of water continued, drawing me toward the hallway. Arthur? I called out again, my voice a little louder this time. The door to the bathroom was slightly ajar, and steam wafted into the hallway. My breath quickened. The scene felt surreal. My own heart beat loud in my ears as I approached the door. And then I saw him. Through the fogged glass of the bathroom mirror, I caught a glimpse of Arthur under the shower. His back turned to me, water cascading over his broad shoulders. I froze, realizing with horror that I'd intruded on something deeply personal. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. He turned slightly, just enough to catch sight of me in the doorway. His eyes widened in surprise. But his expression wasn't what I expected. It wasn't anger or embarrassment, it was calm, composed. I fumbled to find words, my face burning with mortification. I am so sorry, I stammered quickly, averting my eyes. I thought something was wrong. I heard the water. My voice trailed off as my hands instinctively grabbed a towel, holding it out for him. He surprised me with a low, warm chuckle. It's all right, he said, his voice soothing. I should have locked the door. You were just being thoughtful. His reaction disarmed me entirely. I had braced myself for irritation, even anger. But there was none of that. Instead, He stepped out of the shower, wrapping the towel around his waist with an ease that made me feel even more flustered. Water dripped from his silver-streaked hair. And yet he stood there as if this kind of interruption was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "I'll leave now," I mumbled, backing toward the door. I didn't mean to intrude. As I turned to go, his voice stopped me. "Wait," his tone was softer now, almost hesitant. "Thank you for checking on me. It's nice to know someone cares." Those words stayed with me long after I returned home. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of neighborly concern. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted in the days that followed. I avoided him, not out of anger, but because I was too embarrassed to face him. Yet, no matter how much I tried to push the encounter out of my mind, it lingered. It wasn't just his appearance, though that had certainly left an impression. It was the way he had handled the situation with kindness, with grace. He hadn't laughed at my awkwardness or scolded me for barging in. Instead, he thanked me. A few days later, as I was pruning the bushes in my backyard, his voice startled me. "Looks like you've got your hands full," he said, leaning casually against the fence that separated our yards. My first instinct was to stammer out an excuse and retreat. But his warm smile disarmed me yet again. "It's more of a battle than a skill," I replied, attempting a light laugh.
He chuckled. The sound familiar and comforting as before. "If you ever need help, just let me know," he said, his tone friendly and sincere.
At that moment, I felt the burden of my embarrassment start to ease. There was something about Arthur. Something steady. Something grounding. I didn't fully understand it then, but I knew that my life had been nudged off its familiar course, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find my way back. "You're doing better than I ever could." My wife had a knack for these things. Arthur's voice softened, his expression shifting as a flicker of sadness crossed his face. "I've let a lot go. Most of her plants didn't survive. They needed her care." His words surprised me, causing me to pause mid-ask, uncertain about what to say. Without thinking, I blurted out, "I could help. If you'd like." The offer tumbled out of my mouth before I even realized what I was saying. That's how it began. In the days that followed, it became a routine. I'd spend an hour or two in Arthur's yard, helping him trim overgrown bushes and revive neglected flower beds. He worked alongside me, sharing stories about his late wife, his decades as a teacher, and the trips he'd always dreamed of but never taken. His voice was like a comforting melody, steady, warm, and reassuring.
At first, it was simple. Innocent, two neighbors finding companionship in shared tasks. But as the days stretched into weeks, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way his gaze lingered was just a little too long. The softness in his eyes when he spoke to me. And when our hands brushed against each other while we worked. The electric jolt that surged through me was impossible to ignore.
One afternoon, as we stood side by side admiring the freshly tidied garden, he handed me a glass of lemonade. Our fingers touched briefly, and the air between us seemed to shift. I felt my breath catch, but neither of us moved. "You've done more for this place than I have in years," he said softly. His eyes locked on mine. "It's nothing," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. "It's not nothing," he murmured. There was something in his tone. Something raw and unspoken. That sent a shiver through me. I looked away, laughing nervously. "Maybe you just needed a little help." "Or maybe," he said, his voice steady and his gaze unwavering, "I just needed someone to remind me how much life still has to offer." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to retreat, to remind myself that I was a married woman and this was simply an act of neighborly kindness. But another part of me couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. The spark that was undeniably there. That evening changed everything. The rain was soft, pattering gently against the windows. My husband had called earlier, letting me know his business trip would be extended another week. I reassured him over the phone, saying I understood. But deep down, a gnawing sense of loneliness settled over me. I hadn't planned to go to Arthur's house that night. I'd baked cookies earlier to distract myself from the emptiness of the evening. And before I knew it, I was standing at his door, the plate of cookies in my hands. When he opened the door, his smile was warm, and his eyes lit up with surprise. "What's this?" he asked, gesturing toward the cookies. "I thought you might like something sweet," I said, feeling awkward and foolish. I had expected him to decline. But instead, he stepped aside and invited me in. We ended up in his cozy living room, the fire crackling softly in contrast to the chill outside. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did, touching on everything and nothing. But tonight felt different. There was a quiet intimacy in the air. Something unspoken yet undeniably present. As I reached for my glass on the coffee table, it tipped slightly, and Arthur instinctively caught it before it spilled. Our hands collided, and instead of pulling away, we both froze. I looked up to find him staring at me, his gaze searching and uncertain. "You don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable," he said softly, his voice steady but hesitant. "I'm not uncomfortable," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. He leaned in slightly, testing the fragile space between us. I didn't move. And then the distance vanished. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss deepened. And in that moment, months of unspoken longing poured out. I knew it was wrong. This shouldn't be happening. Every fiber of my being screamed. But as his hand cued my face and my fingers found their way to his, the weight of my loneliness melted away. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt seen, wanted, and that feeling, however fleeting or forbidden, was impossible to resist. Nothing else seemed to matter. Only the way his hands embraced me and the way his touch made me feel seen, desired, and alive. The rain outside intensified, but inside the world felt still. The only sounds were our breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. At one point, he paused, his gaze searching mine, as if offering me a chance to say no. But I didn't. When it was over, we sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. He reached for my hand, holding it gently, his thumb brushing softly against my skin. "I never wanted to complicate your life," he said quietly. His voice tinged with regret. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a tumultuous mix of guilt, desire, fear, and exhilaration. I should have felt ashamed. And part of me did. But another part, a deeper part one didn't want to acknowledge, felt liberated. As though I had finally broken free from an invisible cage I hadn't realized was holding me. I stayed longer than I should have that night. When the rain stopped, I finally made my way back home. My heart heavy and my mind racing with questions. What had I done? And why? Despite everything, did I want to do it again? The days that followed were a blur of guilt and longing. Every glance at my husband was a painful reminder of the betrayal. Every quiet moment replayed that night in vivid detail. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But the ache in my chest told me otherwise. At first, Arthur and I avoided each other. It was as though pretending nothing had happened might erase it. But the silence between us quickly became unbearable. One evening, I found myself standing at the fence that separated our yards. He was already there, waiting, as if he'd known I'd come. "I've been thinking about us," he began. His voice steady but tinged with sadness. His eyes locked onto mine. "I never wanted to hurt you or disrupt your life," I whispered, my voice faltering. "Neither did I," I whispered, my voice faltering. The truth was, I didn't even know what I wanted. He sighed, leaning against the fence, as if struggling to find the right words. "I've spent so many years alone, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. And then you came along." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I never expected this." Tears welled in my eyes. "It's not you. It's me. I let this happen. I should have." "No," he interrupted gently. "We're both responsible. But it's not fair to you or to him." His words should have been a relief. And yet they only deepened the ache in my chest. "So what do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He paused, then reached out his fingers, brushing mine. "We move on. We let it go. We pretend it never happened." But pretending was far easier said than done. The tension between us didn't vanish, even as we tried to keep our distance. Every shared glance, every fleeting encounter, felt like a reopened wound. My husband remained oblivious to the storm raging inside me. He continued his routines. And yet I felt more alone than ever. One evening, he asked me why I seemed so distant. His question surprised me. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, unburdening myself of the truth. But fear held me back. Fear of losing everything. So I lied. "I'm just tired," I said. He accepted my answer without hesitation. But the weight of that lie lingered with me long after the words left my mouth. True to his word, Arthur began pulling away. He stopped waiting at the fence and stopped inviting me over. His absence hurt more than I had anticipated. But I told myself it was for the best. I threw myself into rebuilding my marriage, trying to mend what I had allowed to fall apart. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of him in his yard, Each time, my heart would ache with the memory of what we'd shared. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the memory of that night never truly left me. It lingered in the quiet moments, the spaces between thoughts. I often wondered if he felt the same way, if he still thought of me. In the end, there was no tidy resolution, no closure. Just the quiet acceptance that some choices leave scars and some connections, no matter how fleeting, change your life forever.